Hi, my name is Eric Wing. I requested extra time from Angelo because I have a lot of material, but I want to move fast and I will be skipping some slides for time. So let's get to it. For those who haven't seen the official talk description, we're going to focus on the early days of video game music and include games not widely discussed, but nonetheless significant to the history of the industry. I call this an informal history because it is not exhaustive. However, there is also a method to my madness, so maybe I should have included the word opinionated. I am an engineer, not a musician, but I am not an audio engineer. However, I have been involved with implementing audio libraries. I've been involved with OpenAL for a long time. I co-authored a book which contains both core audio and the most comprehensive resource to OpenAL ever written. I got just about every major OpenAL implementer to help in the proofreading process. I also authored AL Mixer, which is a convenience helper library on top of OpenAL. It is used by some commercial engines such as the current SDK. I'm currently working on a new SDK called Blur, which is designed to help make cross-platform native development easier, and you can do it from C, Lua, JavaScript, or Swift. But today I decided I wanted to do a game history talk instead of an audio programming primer. Quick rant. I am disturbed by what passes for video game history nowadays. Among other things, I'm seeing a worship of Super Mario Bros. 1 and the original NES, as if game design starts there and people were all morons before that. And there is a general ignorance and lack of context of time. I kid you not, a friend of mine had a college student that thought Sonic the Hedgehog was created in 1945. So here's some trivia and context. Even though the copyright date of the NES and early games say 1986, it didn't launch until 1987 in America, and didn't start hitting critical mass until 1988. People also forget that supply chains were a bigger problem back then, and producing things like cartridges often severely limited supply. In this talk, we're going to cover areas less traveled and more interesting. Here's a timeline so you don't make the 1945 mistake. Pong is 1972. I've highlighted the great video game crash, which roughly spans 1983 to 1988. The crash doesn't directly factor into this talk, but its effects are felt indirectly. We're going to start with arcades going up to 1984, and then we'll jump to 1988 and focus on the following decade because that is where the next great leap occurs. But speaking of history, here's a history of animation quiz. All of these pictures are from Tom and Jerry from different periods. Can you order these chronologically from oldest to newest? Sorry, I know this would be better if I could show you the animation in motion, but I only had a week to put this entire presentation together. Since I'm in a time crunch, can you pick out which one is the oldest and which one is the newest? Bonus points if you know when each one was made. So, which is the oldest? Show of hands? Top left? Top right? Center? Bottom left? Bottom right? Here is the answer. About all of you are wrong, which is typical for this test. The oldest is the top left. It has the highest quality of animation. You can see shadows. They tried to make Tom look furry. Things like the pan have shading. It has the most foreground assets that need to be animated. It also has the highest quality of frame animation, which I was unable to show you. Now, most people find this unexpected. Isn't it interesting that with all our technology advancements, the one made in the 1940s is the highest quality? We'll come back to this, but ponder on that for a while. Adding music to video games is obvious, so in the beginning it was just a matter of technology limitations. So in 1975 we got our first taste of music in the arcade Gunfight. Space Invaders gave us both continuous music and tempo increases as things got more challenging. Rally X gave us continuous melodic music. Vanguard is a game of many firsts for the industry. It uses two real songs, Star Trek the Motion Picture and Flash Gordon. It has digital voice. It is also the first game with both horizontal and vertical scrolling, and it is the first game with a boss. In the following clip, it starts with Star Trek. It will get the invincibility energy twice and play Flash Gordon. Then it will transition to the Rainbow Zone, which has its own level music and diagonal scrolling.
Bon voyage. Let's attack. Be careful. Let's attack. Rainbow Zone. Be careful.
This arcade tried to capitalize on a rock band from the early 80s. The game lets you play as all the different members of the band and plays their music. This game isn't particularly notable except for the fact that it was probably the first to do this. Spy Hunter licensed the theme song from the 1960s TV series Peter Gunn. I don't know what it's like today, but for a while, more people recognized this as the Spy Hunter theme than knowing it came from something else. Gyrus is notable for pushing harder on music than its peers at the time, so much so they decided to include an extra processor just for audio. The game contains a remix of Bach. It's hard to single out specific arcades because many were all trying different things. So here are some honorable mentions. Frogger is considered the first to switch out music instantly, like when you beat a level. Galaga has multiple ditties. Dig Dug had both music that only played when you moved and changing tempo. Marble Madness might be the first game with what we'd consider a soundtrack by today's standards. It had different music for every level. As I said earlier, adding music to games is obvious. The most interesting question is, how do we harness music in ways unique to our medium? To connect, to touch, and inspire players in ways that are not possible with any other medium. So now we're going to jump to PCs in the year 1988. And to do so, I must talk about Sierra Online, the biggest and most powerful company at the time. Founded by husband and wife team Ken and Roberta Williams at their kitchen table, they created a $1 billion public company. At their height, they had a 28% market share in all entertainment software. This meant a quarter to a third of all the dollars you spent were on Sierra-related titles. Sierra was directly responsible for bringing sound cards and real music to games, and with it, a paradigm shift in how the industry thought about music and games. Digression. Because there was a talk tonight about the lack of women in game composing, here's my additional 2 cents. Sierra was a special place, but nobody recognized it at the time. Here are Sierra's top designers, roughly in chronological order. Roberta Williams, the Sierra co-founder and best known as the creator of the King's Quest series and inventor of the graphical adventure game genre. Al Lowe is most famous for the Leisure Suit Larry series. Trivia: he was a high school music teacher and composed the Larry theme. Mark Crow and Scott Murphy created the Space Quest series. Jim Walls created the Police Quest series and the fictional CIA thriller codename Iceman. Laurie Cole created the Quest for Glory series. My favorite Sierra game is Quest for Glory 2. Christy Marks did a King Arthur game and a Robin Hood game. And yes, she also created Gem and the Holograms. Jane Jensen is best known for creating the Gabriel Knight series. Trivia: she is the only Sierra designer with a formal engineering background. Before being promoted to designer, Josh Mandel wrote a ton of dialogue across many Sierra games. And Lorelei Shannon. That makes 5 women and 5 men. So if we look at today, all men. What happened? Since LucasArts appears later in my talk, here they are. Jane Jensen once said it seemed like a boys' club. In Sierra's days, nobody gave this any thought at Sierra. They had a balanced number of men and women. Of course, why wouldn't it be? It wasn't until Sierra was destroyed that people started noticing Sierra was a total anomaly. Another interesting thing was Sierra's customer base had pretty balanced demographics too. They pulled in far more women and girls than all their competitors. When Sierra died, these customers seemed to disappear because none of the other games targeted them. Anyway, I think this imbalance has been incredibly damaging in many subtle ways. But this is a music talk, so back to music. For completeness, yes, the Apple IIgs and Amiga had good sound capabilities, but DOS dominated, so we're not going to talk about these. For context, this is what most PCs sounded like. So the story goes, Ken asked Roberta, if you could have one wish for your next game, what would it be? Real music. The King's Quest series was the 800-pound gorilla at the time, big enough to convince the industry and consumers to adopt technology. So Ken worked out deals with Roland and Adlib to support and sell their sound cards, and they recruited Hollywood composer William Goldstein to compose the score for King's Quest IV, which also makes this the first time a professional film composer is used for a game. I don't have time to really talk about the devices, so I'll just say the MT32 used recorded samples to build instruments and they sounded really good, but it was expensive. In contrast, the Adlib was a lot cheaper. Adlib used something called FM synthesis. I don't have time to get into it, but basically you construct and manipulate waveforms trying to recreate sounds. In theory, you can make it sound like anything. In practice, it sounds fake and terrible when trying to reproduce real-world sounds. Drums especially sounded staticky and weak. You may not recognize Adlib because Sound Blaster came out a year later and was an Adlib compatible card. It also added a digital audio playback capability. This was usually used for sound effects and not music because of disc constraints, but this extra feature and competitive price point eventually crushed Adlib. King's Quest IV innovated in a lot of other ways too, but I don't have time to go over them. But on a related point to women in games, King's Quest IV was the first game to feature a female protagonist in a meaningful way. Just for context, you play Rosella, the daughter of King Graham, who you played as in the first 2 King's Quest games. In the opening, your father suffers a heart attack and will die the next day. A good fairy tells you of a legendary magical fruit in a distant land that can save your father, but in order to get back, you must recover a stolen talisman from the evil fairy Lilette. I'll play you an excerpt of the King's Quest IV opening on the MT32. Keep in mind what video games sounded like before from both the arcades and the PC speaker. Also notice that the way and type of music is a complete paradigm shift. Where we formerly came from action-oriented Twitch games, Sierra is now trying to connect music to the player in a completely different way. For completeness, I need to show you ad-lib, though I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. Here's just that first part. Also, don't forget to listen to the drums. To help kick off their music card launch, Sierra also hired the rock band Supertramp drummer Bob Siebenberg to compose for Space Quest 3. Space Quest was Sierra's sci-fi themed comedy adventure game. This intro is shorter than King's Quest IV's, so I'll show you more of this one. Like King's Quest IV, notice that the way the music is used is very different than games before it. For completeness, I should also mention General MIDI and the Roll and Sound Canvas. Because of time, I can't get into it, but basically General MIDI is an attempt to create a standard for MIDI cards, and the Roll and Sound Canvas is the first and arguably best of these. Eventually, some sound card manufacturers made sound cards with a daughterboard connector where you could attach a piggyback wavetable card. So for example, you could buy a Sound Blaster 16 and attach a Roll and Sound Canvas daughterboard, and you get the best of both worlds. So let's do a comparison. Here's Doom in ad-lib. Now here's a Roll and Sound Canvas. And finally, for completeness, there were a few games that actually composed with ad-lib as the authentic version. These are extremely rare, but the PC shooter Tyrion is one such game. Here's the sound canvas. This is blasphemous to say, but it's still good, and you get real drums. The composers quickly realized that just trying to reapply their skills from other mediums like movies or albums wasn't fully working, and more was desired. In addition to all the interactivity complexities, the players are still sensory starved, seeking as much information from the game as possible. And they are in front of the same scenes for long periods of time, so the songs need to be interesting and fun, and we need lots of it. So music just to accompany a scene is not enough. In fact, it needs to help drive to fill in the details. This also leads to a lot more experimentation in the style of music. Things that generally would not work in film or concert start becoming interesting to games. This is a fan favorite from Space Quest 3. Bob Siebenberg originally started off more conservative, but realized that going really weird with the song would help define the salesman. In this era, there is one more competing music technology, tracker-based music. It is similar to MIDI, except in addition to just storing what notes to play, it also stores the instrument samples. This requires a sound card with digital audio playback, but no longer needs MIDI. And now the music playback sounds the same in all sound cards instead of varying widely between different devices. There are trade-offs I don't have time to get into. This did not really catch on with the game industry, but was heavily used by the demo scene. It would be criminal not to mention the demo scene when talking about track-based music. Basically, groups write graphical music artistic demos in assembly language and push the hardware to do things that people didn't think were possible. The most famous group is the Future Crew with their 1993 award-winning demo, Second Reality. Here's an excerpt from it. Remember, this is 1993. It ran on a 386 at 33 megahertz. There was no graphics acceleration like today, and it was all written in assembly, no libraries, and it runs in less than 640K of RAM. Star Control 2 was one of the earliest games to use tracked music. Star Control 2 really is one of the greatest games ever made. It's also one of the hardest games to describe. It is a hybrid game unlike anything made before it or after it, and everything about it seems to be in contradiction to itself, yet it all works. It's both an action game and an adventure game. It has possibly the best traditional science fiction writing ever done for a video game, yet also manages to infuse humor in the game without compromising its seriousness. The music is composed by 8 different musicians found during a contest. Despite the enormous differences in styles and absence of coordination, everything works. This is a montage of some different scenes. Star Control also reflects the, quote, early lessons discovered, unquote. Every different part of the game has unique and memorable music. There are 24 different alien races you can talk to, each with a different unique song that helps define their personality. Also, Easter egg, in Alien Conversation, notice the little oscilloscope music visualizer on the right side. Back to MIDI. Since MIDI music is all played back in real time, musicians soon realized they could start doing dynamic things. Here in Space Quest 4, we are at a shopping mall. Every store has its own song. The composer Ken Allen realized he can combine all the songs together and fade in and fade out the volume of all the tracks as you walk closer or farther to each store to give a sense of dynamic position. This is a visualization of a MIDI file. In the top left you can see multiple tracks, each representing a different instrument to be played. With MIDI it is very simple to turn on or off a track, change its volume, or even change the instrument type. Here's a related example. If you look at our 2 blues brothers on stage, one of them has a harmonica that he sometimes plays. The music stays in sync with what the performers are doing. In this case, the MIDI file simply contains all the tracks of the music, including the harmonica. When you need the harmonica part, you turn it on. When you don't, you turn it off. Banjo-Kazooie is fairly famous for its use of dynamic music. Here's a clip where the instruments change when you go underwater. But I also want to point out that as much praise as this game gets for this came almost a decade later than the games that we're talking about, using the exact same techniques. Loom from LucasArts is a really innovative game. You use music to solve puzzles. You carry a magic wand that is like a music instrument. To cast a spell, you must perform a musical sequence. If you're thinking of Zelda 64 Ocarina of Time, it is the exact same idea, but Loom came out almost a decade earlier. So here's an example of casting an open spell on an egg. This casts a sleep spell on the dragon. In 1991, LucasArts deployed their musical dynamic system, iMuse, for their adventure games. While not completely unique, iMuse really pushed the envelope much farther and is really an impressive best-of-breed system. iMuse builds on top of all the dynamic ideas we've talked about so far, and now adds seamless transitions between music. As you go to each new area, a new variation of a song is transitioned into. What I'm about to play is not the authentic iMuse system, but I really like this live recreation of it because I think it conveys the spirit of what's going on really well. Although iMuse was created for adventure games, its pinnacle use was in the spaceflight simulator game TIE Fighter. In this game, you fly for the Empire against those rebel traitors. Since you're now playing from the perspective of the Empire, we suddenly need a new original soundtrack because the happy-go-lucky rebel music won't cut it. TIE Fighter delivered above and beyond. In addition to a unique soundtrack, iMuse sequences were composed to detail all sorts of flight events. Now suddenly, the music isn't just passively along for the ride, but you can now build a mental model of the whole battlefield based on the changing music. Ships are jumping in. Are they large or small? Friend or foe? I just lost a wingman. I completed a mission objective. As I said earlier, players are information starved, so suddenly this extra layer of information is like growing a sixth sense, or more aptly, like using the Force. And when flying without iMuse, it was suddenly like losing a sense, like going blind. TIE Fighter is not a great spectator game because it depends on so much spatial awareness, so I want to start with the slower audio-only mission start clip to get you acquainted with the music and the transitions and show you how you can tell what's going on in battle just by the music. I will point out the different music transitions on the slide at the right time. Now here's an in-game dogfighting clip.
Target disabled.
So now we've come to the end of the era. While dynamic music isn't completely dead, it's pretty bad. Most games will do a transition from calm to battle and back to calm, but that's about as far as it goes nowadays. But let me say a few quick things about a few games that do a little bit more. Ironically, Nintendo was both kind of late to the game and also the last holdout on keeping MIDI. All Zelda games now continue to use dynamic music in different ways. In Wind Waker, you can hear the music both changes when enemies are near, and also the sword strike hits are connected with musical chords. Even back in the GameCube era, some people question why Zelda didn't use fully orchestrated digital audio by then. This is why. Super Mario Galaxy hedged and had some fully orchestrated non-dynamic digital songs and others that were dynamic MIDI. This is a dynamic MIDI example. Red Dead Redemption developed their stem technique. While interesting and innovative, we've lost the melodic qualities of iMuse. It feels a little like reverting from Rally X back to Space Invaders.
So instead of songs, they composed stems.
We had to devise a method by which those stems could be used practically anywhere in the game and interact with other stems.
The team decided to create all the music at 130 beats per minute in A minor, so that the game engine can play stems on top of one another and create music on the fly.
If you jump on a horse, a bass line kicks in. When you start getting chased, timpanis roll in and big fuzz guitars roll in, and there's a shootout. The music actually changes with the action.
Auditorium is a game that uses music as feedback for puzzle solving. Start rant. So, back to Tom and Jerry. This time period was called the Golden Age of Animation. It produced the highest quality stuff, and the greatest animators came out of this time period. William Hanna and Joseph Barbera, Chuck Jones, Tex Avery, and so forth. While there are occasional pockets of brilliance that emerge from time to time, like Studio Ghibli, the animation industry as a whole has never been able to return to producing stuff in the quality and quantity of the Golden Age. I bring this up because in our technology-centric industry, we assume that everything newer is always better because that's how technology works. But I challenge that notion and think game music has stagnated. Real innovation and envelope pushing seems far and few between. In 1994, I couldn't wait to see the future, how iMuse and the sequel to TIE Fighter would blow away what we had. That future never arrived. With the exception of dedicated rhythm games, I cannot think of any game after TIE Fighter where losing the music feels like losing a sense, and games as a whole feel like their music has shifted to background music, with the exception of cutscenes where they just apply standard cinematic techniques. This creates an artificial dichotomy that players can sense subconsciously and is an obstacle to creating sincere connections to the player. And looking back, those past designers did so much with so little. Nothing existed, so they had to invent everything themselves. Today, we have comparatively infinite computing resources available to do things they could only dream of, but in the 20-some to 30 years, we have little to show. They were innovative and ambitious. Today, we seem to find excuses to avoid it, the latest being, my game engine doesn't support that. When they dreamed of new ways to improve the player experience, they created it. Most of us here would like games to be realized as an art form, but how can we expect others to take our medium seriously when we don't even take every aspect of our craft seriously? And this goes beyond just audio to all aspects of our medium, even to how we make them. End rant. For more of my stuff, check out Why We Love Sierra Games on YouTube. It will challenge your thoughts on game design. Also, check out Blur SDK. Finally, I want to switch gears and say a few words about my friend, mentor, and former co-founder, Carlos Acaza. He passed away unexpectedly 1 year ago. He was a friend to this indie meetup group and hosted it a few times. He co-founded Corona Atlantica and was a lead on Illustrator and Flash. Many of you here may have used products he had a hand in. Being at a loss for words, I decided to write a demo in his memory. I took 3 things from our past. He loved splines, and we always wanted to do a spline project together, but never found the time. We had a bad history with particle engines, so I finally wrote a good one using data-oriented design techniques and SIMD intrinsics. We loved the techniques of applying real-time lighting to sprites using shaders. It also happens to relate to this talk. This music is a remix of one of Sierra's most popular songs, Arana's Piece from Quest for Glory 1 from 1989. You'll hear part of the original song in the bumper at the end. The demo itself is inspired from 2 scenes in the Quest for Glory series, but you may also get a demo scene vibe, which is not an accident.